second set of speakers for this panel on Armenian Albanian. We are going to hear Ollie Sayeed, co-authored with Bert, Vaux, both from the University of Pennsylvania, talking about Murmurogenesis and the Armenian stop system. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Has everyone got a handout?
Yes.
Yeah. Good, okay. So today's talk will be about this new term, Murmurogenesis. I hope it's relatively transparent what it means. We're talking about the origin of murmur or breathy voicing, both cross-linguistically, but particularly in the context of this Armenian case study. So the way we're framing things, we have a debate about Proto-Indo-European. This is a very old debate. You probably know something about it already. It's the debate over the reconstruction of the stop system, particularly between the traditional reconstruction and the glottalic reconstruction. We have a puzzle in Armenian. The puzzle in Armenian relates to the PIE debate in the sense that we don't exactly know what the Armenian stop system looks like, and people disagree over to what extent the Armenian stop system looks like the PIE system. And we have a proposed phonetic solution to the Armenian puzzle in the form of what we're calling Murmurogenesis. So to kind of spoil things up front, we are proposing this general process whereby breathy voice stops come from plain voice stops by ordinary phonetic mechanisms. And specifically in Armenian, we are proposing that the vowel fronting that we see in Armenian under the name of Ajarian's law, that I'll get to in a moment, and the breathy voicing that we see across Armenian dialects are both consequences of voicing in Proto-Armenian. And what that means is that breathy voicing is an innovation within the particular Armenian dialects that have breathy voicing, not a property of Proto-Armenian. So we're making these claims about the phonetics of voicing and breathy voicing, and then about the Armenian dialects. We aren't going to draw a conclusion about the traditional reconstruction versus the glottalic theory, I think because Bert and I actually disagree on this. It's more on the traditional side, I'm more on the glottalic side. But you can make your own minds up about that. Okay, so let's first start with a sort of brief introduction to the debate about the Proto-Indo-European stop system. So the traditional reconstruction has these three series of stops, which we'll call Series 1, Series 2, and Series 3. Pretty much everyone agrees that Series 1 was something like a plain voiceless stop. So this is what we see, for example, the word for three, which is tres in Latin, tres in Greek, and trias in Sanskrit. That seems unambiguously to be just an ordinary voiceless stop. The debate is particularly about what was in Series 2, which is traditionally reconstructed with a D, and there's a kind of follow-up debate about what exactly was in Series 3, which in the traditional reconstruction is a voiced aspirate or a breathy voice stop. And this has kind of some fricative reflexes across the daughter languages, some breathy voice reflexes, and some plain voice reflexes. Now this system is kind of funny, and one thing I want to stress is that nobody ordered this, as it were. Nobody wanted a system with a plain voiceless stop, a plain voice stop, and a voiced aspirate. Because originally, Proto-Indo-European was reconstructed based on Sanskrit with a 4-stop system. So we had this nice symmetry where we had a voiceless T, a voiced D, a voiceless aspirate TH, and a voiced aspirate DH. And then it was discovered by Saussure in 1892 that whenever we have a TH in Sanskrit and the Indic languages, we have T followed by a laryngeal in other branches. So well, I guess a reconstructed laryngeal. So it seems like what looks like a voiceless aspirate actually has this very particular patterning, and we can explain it by saying that there was no voiceless aspirate in Proto-Indo-European, and this is a kind of Indo-Iranian specific development in the context of a following laryngeal. So we had this nice system, and now we've removed a piece, and we ended up with this system that nobody really wanted. And this point was made by Jacobson in the 50s that actually this system looked quite strange. At the time, we thought it was completely unattested. We now actually have one example which comes from Michael Weiss recently, which is Cao Bang. That's a Thai Kodai language from northern Vietnam, which actually has exactly this system. I'll say a little bit more about Cao Bang later because I think it's instructive as to how the PIE system might have come about. So the most popular alternative reconstruction of the PIE stop system is called the glottalic theory, and it differs in the reconstructions of the stops in series 1 and 2. So like I say, series 2 and 3. So everyone agrees on series 1 that we had a voiceless stop. The glottalic theory puts a plain voice stop in series 3. That's where the traditional reconstruction has a voiced aspirate. Oh, and I should say this information is on the handout in case you want to refer to it throughout the talk. And in series 2, where we used to have a plain voice stop, we have something that I've written here as capital D. Different versions of the glottalic theory disagree about what exactly this is. So there's the kind of classic glottalic theory, which comes independently from Gamkrelidze and Ivanov and Hopper in America in the same year. I think it's kind of funny that Amaz Gamkrelidze has a name that begins with an ejective stop as a Georgian speaker, and I don't know if I want to say so, if that's a reason, but anyway, they incidentally propose an ejective stop in series 3. The Leiden school, as represented by Fritz Kotland and Alexander Lubotsky and others, propose a pre-glottalized stop for series 2. So they disagree on in what way exactly this series 2 stop is glottalic, and also whether it was voiced or voiceless. But both of these camps agree that series 1 was an ordinary T, and series 3 was an ordinary D. Maybe you want to say something about allophonic aspiration to get some of the sort of breathiness outcomes, but I don't think we have to be wed to that particularly. Okay, so let's talk about the Armenian stops and this change of Jarian's law, which I think is sort of interesting phonetic evidence as to what the Proto-Armenian values of the Armenian stops were. So Armenian, in case you don't know, is one of the most linguistically divergent branches of Indo-European. It has, tons and tons of varieties, more than 500 varieties, which you can read about in all of Bert's dialectological work. They are broadly split into Eastern and Western, with 2 corresponding modern standard languages. The standard Eastern Armenian is based on the standard from the Caucasus in Armenia. Standard Western Armenian is based on the Anatolian standard, based around the variety spoken in Istanbul. And the Armenian dialects are grouped traditionally into these 7 groups based on what stops they have in the given in each given series. So you'll notice that every dialect agrees on series 1. We always have not a plain voiceless T, but a voiceless aspirate. So they all agree on that. So we have basically nothing to say about series 1 in this talk. In series 2, we get a mixture of a plain voiceless T and a plain voiced D. So you'll note that I guess neither of the PIE reconstructions reconstruct a T in this position, but some versions of the traditional reconstruction reconstructs a D in this position. The glottalic theory wants this to be something glottalic. And in series 3, most interestingly, we get this sort of range of 4 different realizations. 2 varieties, including the variety represented by the standard Eastern language and the classical language, have a D, in fitting with what the glottalic theory says. Groups 1 and 2 up here have a breathy voice aspirate term, and that's particularly the variety around Yerevan, the capital, and in New Jaffa. So that's more in keeping with what the traditional reconstruction of PIE would say. So something else that we should bring up at this point is that is this process whereby vowels are fronted after series 3 stops in a bunch of varieties that you have listed on the handout in front of you. It was first noticed by Ajarian in the 1950s in Van. And the process occurs after these original series 3 stops, which in Van now are all devoiced, and we don't exactly know what values they had at the time that the change happened. So you can see, for example, with the stage here, Bach becomes A in Van, so that A has fronted to A. And so on with O and U and U and so on. So we have this fronting process that's conditioned by the series 3 stops. And how we analyze this fronting process depends on what we think the series 3 stops were at the time that Ajarian's law took place. In terms of the dialect distribution of Ajarian's law, it kind of it is not not exactly consistent with this division in the sense that within a particular group we get both varieties that have Ajarian's law and that don't have Ajarian's law. So it seems to have kind of diffused rather than being, it's hard to put a phylogenetic tree on top of this. But we've given some examples of individual dialects from each dialect group that show some kind of Ajarian's law. In terms of the mechanism of Ajarian's law, so it's this sort of fronting process. It's generally agreed, following analyses by Bert in his 1998 book, I believe, to have these two steps. So first, we have tensing, which is actually conditioned by the stops themselves. So they become plus ATR phonologically, if you like. And then once they are tense, you have fronting of plus ATR vowels. So we have these two proposed stages to the change. Thanks. But the question is what this series 3 stop was at the time that Ajarian's law applied to Proto-Armenian. So if we assume that the kind of Armenian was sort of close to the PIE system at the very early stages, then Brugman PIE, so kind of classic PIE, would prefer that we had a voiced aspirate here, whereas glottalic PIE would prefer that we had a plain voice stop here. Okay, so let's talk about the specifics of the debate about the Armenian stops. So our representative that we're taking of the position that Proto-Armenian did have breathy voice is Andrew Garrett in this paper from 1998. And his idea is that Proto-Armenian looked basically like today's groups 1 and 2. I'm not sure specifically what he thinks about the other stops, but what he is clearly arguing for is that we need to have breathy voicing. And that makes Armenian look more like traditional PIE and look less like glottalic PIE. What we're claiming today is that borrowings and the phonetic evidence we'll talk about later tell us that Proto-Armenian looked basically like group 6. In other words, basically like classical Armenian, which is what you might expect, given that classical Armenian is the oldest recorded Armenian. And that had a D in series 3 rather than an aspirated D. That makes Armenian look more like glottalic PIE, for whatever that's worth. So Garrett has these three main arguments. There's an argument about the dialect distribution, there's an argument about the behavior of the voiced aspirate H, and then there's an argument about the phonetic plausibility, plus an ordering paradox that we might get to later. So let's go through these arguments in turn. So Garrett says that we only see Ajarian's law in dialects that don't have breathy voice stops. So this claimed correlation between the existence of breathy voicing, or I guess the non-existence of breathy voicing, and the presence of Ajarian's law. And for Garrett, we have a sort of Bohalan explanation, if you like, whereby the tensing caused by Ajarian's law comes from a reanalysis of breathy voicing. And the idea is that you can only reanalyze breathy voicing if you then lose breathy voicing along with the reanalysis. You don't simultaneously interpret breathy voicing as something else and also as breathy voicing. At least that's Garrett's claim. So his claim is that dialects only phonologize tensing if they also lost breathiness. You'll see that this is not exactly true. So if we go back to this table, we see that in group 2 we have Ajarian's law, but we also have breathy voicing. So it is at least not true, the naive version of the claim where we lose breathy voicing simultaneously with the introduction of Ajarian's law. And the correlation doesn't hold in the other direction as well, as evidenced by group 3, where we lose breathy voicing, but that's not accompanied simultaneously by Ajarian's law. So we get all 4 possibilities: breathiness or no breathiness, Ajarian or no Ajarian. So it doesn't seem like there's really much of a correlation here that needs to be explained. Garrett's second argument is the behavior of Proto-Indo-European y or yod, which becomes a voiced H in Armenian And this actually triggers a Jarian's law along with the series 3 stops. And his claim is that we expect this if a Jarian's law is triggered by breathiness, and H is kind of breathy par excellence, but not if it's stop voicing that matters. Because even though voiced H is obviously voiced, there's other stuff that's obviously voiced, voiced sonorants, which don't seem to trigger this change. I think this is Garrett's best argument. I think what we would say to this is that you could imagine a sort of phonologization stage in between where the change is phonologized as applying to phonologically, representationally plus ATR stuff. And then you can tell a story about why voiced H is plus ATR. If you don't like that, then that's okay. As for the phonetic arguments, Garrett says the breathy voice story is more phonetically plausible, and that's based on this idea that breathiness is hard to innovate. So if breathiness is hard to innovate, then you can see why Garrett's story that breathiness must have been inherited makes sense, because it's less plausible given that we already know that breathiness exists elsewhere in Indo-European, specifically in Indic, that we have breathiness appearing independently in Armenian. And he tells a story about breathiness having this kind of fronting effect, and breathy vowels also getting misperceived as tense. I'm going to skip over this ordering paradox, but we can talk about that in the question period if you like. Okay, so our analysis of a Jarian's law. To repeat our claims today again, we are claiming that the vowel fronting caused by a Jarian's law and the breathy voicing are not causally related to each other. They are causally related through kind of an earlier voice state, which is an intermediate. So rather than having breathy voicing cause a Jarian's law, we have voicing cause a Jarian's law, and we also have voicing cause breathy voicing by this process we call murmurogenesis. So that means breathy voicing is an innovation rather than an inheritance from PIE. So what is murmurogenesis, finally? So what we are assuming is that Proto-Armenian had a plain voiced D, and this D had a phonetic goal of being voiced. And for the idea of what it means to have a phonetic goal, you can look to these bite rock experiments, various other experiments where you sort of mess with people's mouths and put things in their mouths, and they manage to find a way to get to the acoustic signal they're trying to achieve. So they have some kind of target, and they are, speakers will do whatever ad hoc articulatory strategies will tend to produce that target. In the case of voicing, you need to expand the pharynx, and to expand the pharynx, you can basically expand it at either end. So you can advance the tongue root so there's more space at the top, or you can lower the larynx so there's more space at the bottom. These are basically just ways to generate a bigger body of air inside the vocal tract. I think my slides are out of order here. Let me carry on with this. These two strategies have other phonetic consequences. So tongue root advancement is tensing. That's what advanced tongue root means. So if you're trying to produce voicing and you kind of advance your tongue root, then you just get tensing of neighboring vowels kind of automatically. And you maybe also could say that you get dorsum fronting and raising. I think there's disagreement about this, but because the dorsum of the tongue is attached to the root of the tongue via the rest of the tongue, when you raise the tongue, you end up raising all of the tongue as well. So you could explain the fronting and raising parts of a Jarian by the same mechanism. You could say they happened later. The second part, so larynx lowering, this has been found to lead to breathiness, as we see in this paper by Trigo, which is a kind of phonetic work on the origins of breathiness through larynx lowering. So our claim is that breathy voicing and tensing are not causally related, they are both effects or consequences of plain voicing. Now, as to whether this is kind of phonetically plausible, it's actually not true that breathy voicing is quite as rare as is sometimes assumed. So we have Kalbang, this example we've already talked about, where we get the Kalbang breathy voice stops from plain voice stops, interestingly. So actually that is a directly recorded parallel to what the glottalic story would have to be for the origin of breathy voicing. We have Kelabit, we have Maranao. I think those are both in the Philippines, I might be wrong. we have Perak and Sundanese, also from Southeast Asia. So this is not that unnatural an event. And in particular, if it's not that unnatural an event, it's not so bad to say that breathy voicing happened independently in Armenian and in Indic, which are the two daughter dialects of Indo-European where we see breathy voicing. The kind of real interesting evidence in favor of an account like this is this evidence from borrowing. Thank you. So we're running out of time, but quickly it looks as if kind of pan-Armenian borrowings, so very early borrowings that exist in all the dialects, show voice stops going into series 3 rather than into series 2. So that tells us that whatever this kind of ancestral system was like, it must have had something voiced in series 3, and in particular nothing voiced in other places that would have been more natural candidates to be borrowed, for a voice stop to be borrowed into. So we think a classical system is more like the original, and that is coherent with the phonetic story we're telling about murmurogenesis. I won't talk about the flip-flop change. Just to finish very quickly, our proposed chronology is in Proto-Armenian we have ordinary voicing in series 3 with tongue root advancement kind of at the top and breathiness at the bottom, as it were, and maybe something about dorsum fronting and raising as well. We have phonologization of vowel tensing, as we see in varieties like Agulus and Kachavan. We have phonologization of fronting, which is the classic Ajarian's law, as first noticed in Van. And then later we have consonant shifts that kind of mess up the historical Ajarian's law system, including, in some cases, producing new voice stops that don't trigger Ajarian's law. So Ajarian's law has now been phonologized and is not, being reactuated or re-triggered by new voice stops in varieties like Van and Valatia that have those. Okay, so conclusions. Proto-Armenian looked basically like classical Armenian with a plain voiced D in series 3. The mechanics of producing voicing led to these two effects, breathiness and vowel shifts, as described by Ajarian's law in the daughter varieties. There's a phonetic story behind murmurogenesis, which is articulately plausible and is not actually as typologically rare as sometimes gets described. If you want to draw a conclusion about PIE, at least the Armenian stop system is not an argument for the Brugman reconstruction of PIE. Whether you want to say it is an argument for the glottalic reconstruction is a separate question, but it is at least not implausible for breathiness to have been innovated independently in Armenian and in Sanskrit. Okay, I'll finish that.